we live? Are we live? We're live. Hello. I think we're live, at the very least. Okay. Well, we are definitely live. Hi. My name's Rowan. I run a stream called Broken Cowbell. This might be the first you've heard of it because I've been on hiatus for 2 years. That's how it be sometimes. Now, this channel, this YouTube channel that I'm currently streaming on, is sort of the archive channel for what used to be my Twitch stream. Because of the changes that they're planning on making to Twitch, or they seem to be making to Twitch, I am going to be switching over to YouTube. And so the archival channel is now just the full channel. So the stream is going to be basically the same. I have a different layout. I've updated the layouts. I have mic filters that make everything sound better. I have noise cancellation. I've got all sorts of stuff lined up. But the very first thing that I wanted to do when I got the stream started back up is make sure that I got to start what's on the table. And I'm gonna explain what this show is just a second. First, I have to share the stream with everybody. We're just getting started here today. Go ahead and send out a quick tweet. The first episode of my new show, What's on the Table, where I talk about ttrpgs. Come on in. Basically the same post. Other such social medias. This is probably something I should have done before I started streaming, but you know, that's okay. Don't make mistakes. We're all here. Unlisted, so no. Follow me. Close some of my tabs here. Get Twitch chat. It looks like the chat client for Stream Elements is bugged. I think instead I will YouTube, you're not. Then I'm just gonna pull up chat in the other in another window. Just have the stream up in another window. I believe I can pop out chat. Yeah. Got the stream element spot here. This is all very rudimentary stuff. I haven't done anything crazy in the past 2 years with the stream setup itself. It's just changing the layout, adding new things, coming up with new ideas. People are probably, if they've been following the stream, wondering why I went on hiatus for 2 years. And of course, the answer to that is I moved to Texas, and then I moved back up to the Midwest, and then I moved down to Texas, and then I moved back up to the Midwest, and then I moved down to Texas, and then I moved back up to the Midwest. So, of course, when you're moving, when you're like literally I can't call it couch surfing because that's not what happened. But but when you're bouncing back and forth between two locations like 6 times in just a year or so, it's really hard to stream. That's all I'll say. It's really hard to have consistency. So this is what's on the table. Let me give you the spiel. All right. I am a big fan of tabletop role-playing games. I love them. I've been playing them since I was a kid. And I've always wanted to do a stream themed around tabletop role-playing games. But I don't want to run a tabletop role-playing game on my stream. That's been done before. People do that all the time. You know, we might do that sometime in the future, but this isn't something that I want to like have as the big resurgence of the stream. I want to have sort of TTRPG focused content that doesn't involve playing the TTRPGs on stream, at least not at first. And so I thought, well, I know a lot about TTRPGs, and I've played a lot of TTRPGs. And so I thought to myself, okay, how many TTRPGs do I own? Right. Like how many do I have in my collection? And so I opened up my folder of TTRPGs because of course I have them all in PDF format now. And I have almost 400 of them in total. And so I thought, okay, that's a lot. That's a lot of TTRPGs. So what if I just did a show where I looked at all of my TTRPG collection? Because I haven't read most of these things. And so over the past couple of weeks, I've been sort of conceptualizing, building up, oh, I'm going to start streaming again. I have to get everything set up. What am I going to do for this show idea that I've come up with? And that's crystallized into What's on the Table, which is a show about looking at TTRPGs, a first glance at TTRPGs, talking about mechanics, talking about rule books, talking about what to look for when you're in the store, when you're in the game store, and you pick up a rule book off the shelf and you're paging through it. What to look for, what games you might like, what games I might like, and how you can puzzle out a game and what it's all about before you even put it on the table, right? So that's the idea. That's the pitch. And today, for the very first episode, the pilot episode of What's on the Table, we have Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, 3.5e, D&D 3.5e. This is a game that is very near and dear to my heart. I think it's very near and dear to a lot of people's hearts. And it is probably one of the big ttrpgs of all time. This is like everybody who I know has played Dungeons and Dragons 3.5e. So why are we talking about it today? Well, first and foremost, it's approachable, right? It's something that a lot of TTRPG enthusiasts can instantly recognize. They instantly understand. They saw that player's handbook font on the fake leather book cover, and they were like, "Oh, 3.5e, I'm there." For newcomers who don't know anything about TTRPG, Dungeons and Dragons 3.5e is a great place to start. And here's why. I'm going to crystallize everything I'm talking about into a single little bubble of knowledge, of word knowledge, and communicate it to you right now. Dungeons and Dragons 3.5e. I believe, in my heart of hearts, that this is the worst tabletop role-playing game. So that's where we're at. This is probably going to chase off a lot of people. Just me saying that right there. This is my least favorite tabletop role-playing game, period. And we're going to talk about why, and we're going to talk about the elements of the game that lead me to that conclusion, and also why you might like it anyway. Okay? So that's what we're doing today. But before we get into the Dungeons and Dragons 3.5e player handbook, we have to establish some baselines. First of all, this isn't a review show, okay? In order to review a game, you have to play it extensively. And a lot of the games we're going to be talking about on this show, I've never played. Of course, I've played this one. But there's going to be a bunch of blind sort of taste tests for tabletop role-playing games that we're going to cover. It's going to be a first look. It's going to be an initial impression. We're not going to be diving deep into, having a session, pulling out all the equipment. I've got like dice and cards and little gaming chips all over the office. But I don't have a bunch of people to play with right now. I don't have an entire group of D&D players waiting behind the curtain who are going to jump out of the woodwork and we're going to play an entire campaign for you on stream to test the game being good or not. No. This is a solo thing, at least for this second. And so what I really want to cement in here is that this is not a review show. This is not an indication of whether or not the tabletop role-playing games are quality. We're talking about what makes them tick. We're talking about mechanics, what to look for, what to avoid, how we can measure mechanics qualitatively. And in order to do that, I have first of all, some rules, and second of all, some terms. We'll start with the rules. First of all, the game has to be in PDF format. I'm cheating a little bit here because I have a PDF version of the Dungeons and Dragons player handbook, which I don't believe was ever made officially. I believe this is an Internet Archive copy. To be perfectly clear, I own the book. This is a game that I own. I did not pirate this. I own the Player's Handbook. I have owned it for 15 years. This is never... I'm going to be buying. Rule number 2, I will always be paying money for the tabletop role-playing games that I look at on this channel. I'm not going to be accepting donated copies. And that restricts the list of games to games that are currently being sold. So that's the 3 rules, okay? It has to be a PDF. It has to be bought by me personally. And it must be currently available for sale. As best to the best of my knowledge. The preferable platform for buying TTRPGs is itch.io, which is where I have acquired most of my collection. However, there are some situations where you'll need to go buy your TTRPGs at your local game shop, or perhaps even a bookstore. In those cases, I will look for PDFs of those books after purchasing a copy of the book for myself. Now, one more thing. This is rule number 4, if you're keeping track. For rule number 4, I'm not going to be reviewing supplements or expansions. Sorry, let me clarify. A supplement in this case is something that's made by somebody who didn't make the original thing. For D&D 5e, I believe it's Frog Gaming. It has made a bunch of supplement campaigns for D&D 5e. But those are sort of their own standalone thing. But of course, they're not games, right? They're not a TTRPG, so I can't review them like one. They're a campaign that you use a different system to sort of slot in and play the campaign that you have. Now, I could review settings and campaigns and materials and supplements like that, but not on this show, not right now, because that would be simply too much to cover. An expansion, for instance, in the case of Dungeons and Dragons, is anything that is a supplement to the game that is made by the company who made that game for the purposes of playing that game, right? So we're looking at the Player's Handbook here, but there's also the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's also the Monster Manual. And there's a whole bunch of expansions that add stuff to 3.5e. People widely recognize D&D 3.5e as having some of the highest expansion counts in TTRPG history, from what I understand. Maybe only second to something even bigger and more mysterious. So we're not going to be looking at expansions. And the sole purpose of that is, I believe that you should be able to buy one book, and by the end of reading that single book, you should be able to play a full session of that tabletop role-playing game. It doesn't matter if the second session requires you to buy a second book. If you can get a full play session in with a single book, that's a game. All right, and that's up for looking at. So D&D 3.5, Player's Handbook. You should probably also have the Dungeon Master's Guide. D&D does this all the time. They make you buy multiple books that you don't necessarily need because they're all hard copy books. They're all full color prints on really big paper. So they take up a ton of space and they're very expensive. And then they make you buy a bunch of those. But anyway. So, to get back to what we're doing, those are the 4 rules, okay? Has to be a PDF. It must be purchased by me. And It must. Uh-oh. I'm getting fuzzy stream brain on the first day. Can't remember my own rules. It has to be a PDF, has to be purchased by me, can't be a supplement or an expansion. Well, that's what we in the business call nerves right there. Platform. Nervous. Reason. No. At some point I'll go back and I'll figure out what that's okay. We do this a lot here. Broken cowbell. I'm a bit of a scatterbrain. A bit of a klutz. But let's talk terms. When we're talking about the mechanics of a ttrpg, we're not talking about the setting, we're not talking about the types of stories you can tell, though we will talk about that. We'll glance over them. What we're really talking about is we're talking about the crunch, okay? Anybody who's in board gaming communities or tabletop RPG communities in general will be able to will know exactly what I mean when I say the word crunch. Right? We're talking about the opposite of crunch. We're talking about how the mechanics interact with each other. We're talking about what kind of dice you're rolling, how many dice you're rolling. How does it feel to hold that many dice? What kind of numbers do you get out of that? Do you have to do formulas? Should you bring a calculator? Do you need scratch paper? How in-depth are the mechanics? Can you ignore some of the mechanics? Are the mechanics beneficial to the story that the game is trying to tell? That's what we're going to be talking about. And to that end, I have 3 sliders. 3 big sliders that I'm going to be using to qualify all of the different mechanics in every game we're going to be covering on this show. Not going to be changing it at all. Those 3 sliders are dry versus wet, mushy versus crunchy, and thin versus thick. Okay? Let's start with crunchy. That's the term people know. All right? That's the term people get when they think about tabletop role-playing games. They say, "Oh, I've been playing tabletop role-playing games for so many years, Rowan. I know what crunchy means," but somebody might not. Okay? So let's cover it. A game that is crunchy has big numbers or a lot of mechanics that you need to focus on, right? So if you show up to the game and the game says, for instance, this example is going to be very pertinent to this episode. If the game, for instance, says you have to roll dice to calculate your stats calculate into modifiers. Your modifiers apply to rolls, and your rolls apply to your actions in the game. That's crunch. All right, all those little conversions. This number becomes this number. This number becomes this number. This number applies to this, and this other thing. That's crunchiness, right? The opposite of crunch is mush. A mushy game does not focus as much on the numbers. It doesn't focus as much on the dice rolls necessarily. You know, these might be games more designed for storytelling, where you're supposed to be sitting down and interacting more with the players around you rather than interacting with the mechanics of the game directly. You know, they might have very vague mechanics that are designed to sort of inspire you, but not necessarily ones that restrict you to a certain type of play. That's going to define mushiness. Next, we're going to define dry versus wet. When a mechanic is wet, I want you to think about a cup of tea. Okay, you have the tea bag, right? You have the tea bag, and you have your mug of hot water. All right. The tea bag here is the mechanics. The mug of water is the story. What a lot of people want when they're playing a tabletop role-playing game is that they want those mechanics. They want those mechanics to go right on in that story. They want those mechanics to be super relevant to how the game, how the game is played, interacting, mingling with what the game actually is. I have a really good example for this. There is a game called Sleepaway. It's a very good game. I've looked at it before. I'm a big fan. It might come up later on this show. We don't know yet. But Sleepaway has a ton of really good mushy mechanics, because Sleepaway is a game that is, sorry, not mushy. It has a lot of wet mechanics, because those mechanics, right, they're tying into the idea of Sleepaway, which is this game. I have that title, right? I have the title correct. I really hope I have the title correct. Let me just double check that real quick so I'm not talking about some crap I don't know. Yep, it's Sleepaway. Okay. I wasn't scatterbrained this time. The thing about Sleepaway is that it's a game about basically remembering your childhood experiences of summer camp, channeling those feelings into telling a story that revolves around a fictional, supernatural, sort of metaphysical summer camp, where the campers and the counselors are being hunted by a sort of metaphorical monster, a symbolic monster known as the Lindworm. It's a really, really interesting tabletop role-playing game. Every single mechanic in that game is dedicated to that theme. Every single one. You can't go a fifth of a page in that book without running into something that would only work in that game. These things that are only relevant to these specific types of experiences, evoking that feeling of being on summer vacation and going to summer camp and, staying in a log cabin, being out in the woods. That liminal space is dedicated, or the mechanics are dedicated to that liminal space. And that makes those mechanics very wet. The tea bag is in the mug. The tea bag's getting wet. It's making tea. You have a cup of tea. The opposite of wet is dry. The mechanics are out of the mug. The mechanics are not dedicated to the game experience itself. They're dedicated to some other concept. A great example here is that in the original run of the Chaosium system, you may know the system as the one that is behind Call of Cthulhu, which is a very famous tabletop role-playing game. That game, Call of Cthulhu, had an alternate game known as Basic Role-Playing. I believe they were released at about the same time. Basic Role-Playing was built on the same mechanics as Call of Cthulhu. Excuse me, but it was built for literally generic role-playing experience. This was not something that was designed for a specific form of play. This was a game that was supposed to work for anything that you had. Any setting, any campaign was supposed to be able to use basic role-playing as the baseline for it. And when you have something super general like that, something that doesn't really have a thematic focus, when that tea bag isn't in that cup, that's a really dry mechanic. It's something universal that doesn't necessarily lend itself to the game you're currently playing. That's a very dry scenario. The final slider we have is thin versus thick. Okay? A thick game is a game where you are slogging through it. Not necessarily even in a bad way. But you're there at your friend's house, you're gonna be there for 4 hours. You have an entire character sheet, you've got dice, you've got cards, you've got an entire folder. At one point, I was playing Pathfinder with a group of my friends in college, and each of us had an entire fucking portfolio of things about our characters, about the world that the characters were in. It was so thick. There was so much of it, right? Opposite of thick is thin. One page tabletop role playing games that are literally confined to a single American 8.5 by 11-inch piece of paper. Though, you know, those games have become a lot more popular recently because they're thin. You don't have to spend a ton of time on them. You don't have to spend a ton of time learning the mechanics. You can sit down, you can print the piece of paper out, you put it on your desk, you grab a pencil, and then by the time you've gotten to the end of the page, like you're reading a sheet of music, by the time you're at the end of that one page, the game's over. There are a lot of gamers who really like thin games. There are a lot of gamers who like thick games. For all of these sliders, we're talking about personal preference. This is why I say it's not a review show, right? We don't review games here. We're talking about qualitative statements. We're talking about, you know, is the game the kind of game that you, the viewer, would like to play? And what I want people to do who are watching this is think about, okay, if you've played TTRPGs before, what do you like? You know, do you like dry or wet? Do you like mushy or crunchy? Thin or thick? Do you like games that really like sink in where it's wet, crunchy, and thick, and you're just sitting there? You know, you're just sitting in the thick of it. It's like a creme brulee that you're like stuck in, you know? Or do you like games that are kind of, you know, dry and thin? Do you like games that are, you know, do you like games that maybe don't even feel like tabletop role playing games? Games that feel more like little puzzles or mechanical gimmicks on a page, you know? These are the things that I want my viewers to think about when they're looking at the games that we're talking about, when they're looking at tabletop role-playing games. I want them to be thinking about, oh, is this dry? Is this wet? It's crunchy or mushy? It's thin? Is this thick? The other thing, this isn't on the list, but I do want to talk about it. I'm gonna give myself a nice big font here. Something I want to talk about is the scale of fudge. We use a lot of food terms here because I usually have food on the brain. The scale of fudge is that we have games, lower the font. A lot of times we have games that are very, very rules picky, right? They really want you to follow the rules, okay? We call those hard rules games. We'll just say hard rules for now. Hard rules games, whoopsie, are a sort of subset to soft rules games. Soft rules games are games where the rules are, again, maybe a little closer to mushy, maybe a little bit vague or up to player interpretation. Or games where you can additionally come up with your own rules and that's built into the system. Next, I want to introduce the idea of fudging. So fudging is the act of messing with the rules because you don't want to deal with them, right? You know, you rolled a 1. You don't want to be rolling a 1. And you talk to Billy, who's across the table, and you say, Billy, can I just not have rolled a 1 because that's going to be super boring? You know, this is like the last thing we're doing for the whole session. If my guy just falls off a cliff, I'm going to leave. And I'm going to give you a bad review on Yelp. Billy says, well, that's okay, Rowan. We'll fudge the rules a bit, right? That's where the term comes from. So a game that is fudgy is a game where the mechanics are maybe a bit unpopular or get in the way a lot and require players to fudge the rules to make the game more smooth. You see this a lot with really, really crunchy games. Anytime you forget a mechanic oops, you're playing Gloomhaven and you forgot to take a short rest at the end of your turn, so you take a short rest at the start of your next turn, because what's the difference? That's fudging. You're not technically following the rules, but you're doing your best and you're doing what's fun for you and your playgroup. That's important. I am a wholehearted believer in the idea that fudging is good for players. Always fudge if you have to. Don't worry about whether the game supports fudging. Don't worry about, oh, you know, they designed the game in a specific way. No. If you're not having fun, make your own fun. This brings us to the fourth category, which might get me a little bit demonetized. When you have a rule set that's fudgy, there's a step beyond that. We've talked about hard rules, right? Rules that you have to follow. The opposite of hard rules, and the sequel to fudgy, is fucky. A fucky rule set is a rule set where the rules don't work, right? Or they don't make sense. And so you have to fudge. You are contractually obligated to fudge. If you don't fudge, you might as well stop playing. It's on a level beyond fudge. You're not fudging the rules, you're just fucking with them. You're just fucking with it so that you can get through the game, so that you can get to the end of the session, so that you can probably do something else. That's fucky. People, in my experience, have a habit of playing fucky games when they want to be playing hard rules games. And I don't judge. I certainly don't. But I do want to call attention to the fucky category here, because that is going to determine a lot of what we're talking about with 3.5e. Now, I know that everybody loves 3.5e. Everybody loves it. You know, Neverwinter Nights, Knights of the Old Republic. These are big games. 3.5e famously inspired Pathfinder, which is a very, very famous role-playing game system. I know people who still exclusively play Pathfinder, and I've heard that they're coming out with a second edition of Pathfinder as well. So, like, all of this stuff, when we're talking about 3.5e, we're talking about a juggernaut of the tabletop role-playing game space. One of the reasons that I wanted it to be the first thing that I covered. At the same time, we're talking about a game that has a lot of problems. 3.5e is on the tailcoat of D&D 2nd edition, also known as Advanced D&D, or AD&D. I'll enunciate very carefully on that because it's easy to mess up these acronyms. So this is, of course, the revision of the 3rd edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which means it's the sequel to AD&D, which was the sequel to Dungeons and Dragons, the original one. Now, I have played every version of Dungeons and Dragons, of which there's about 5, right? I'm not counting the original 3.0 edition, because that edition is just an even worse version of 3.5 edition. Some people might actually prefer it. Those people play Neverwinter Nights 1 and refuse to play Neverwinter Nights 2, but that's a bit of an inside joke, so I won't cover it too much. The thing about 3.5 edition is that it is the middle ground between the specialized versions of 4 and 5 and the extremely weird versions of 1 and 2. So we have a combination of a system that's very generalized and a system that's kind of trying to clean itself up a little. And that's going to create a very kind of interesting vibe with 3.5e. Because you have to remember that back around the time of D&D First Edition and D&D Second Edition, D&D was the tabletop role-playing game. It wasn't a role-playing game, it was the tabletop role-playing game. But by the time Third Edition rolled around, the market was changing. Chaosium, Call of Cthulhu, that system I talked about earlier, I believe had been released by D&D 3.5. A whole slew of competitors had been introduced to the market, and Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition was no longer basically the biggest shark in this pool, right? There were now other sharks, and more than that, there were smaller fishies running around too. Nowadays, especially on itch.io and Kickstarter, the tabletop role-playing game scene has exploded. Just like the board game scene, it's exploded in popularity. And so we're seeing a ton of new stuff. You might say, well, Rowan, why not talk about 5th edition? 5th edition, goodness. 5th edition is probably what people would consider the ideal version of D&D right now. People really didn't like 4th edition. People really liked 3.5, and people were pretty okay with advanced D&D. Very few people actually played the original versions of Dungeons and Dragons. It was a bit of a janky run. It was a bit of a weird release. And so for a lot of people, their first introduction to Dungeons and Dragons was this game, myself included. This was my first tabletop role-playing game ever. And when I was a child, I opened this book and I said to myself, oh my God, there's so much stuff you can do in this game. There are so many things that you can do and experience. There's so many ideas, so many experience. Oh my God, so many mechanics, so many rulings that you can use or choose not to use. And I said to myself, this is a game where you can do anything because there's rules for everything. Now I'm 25. And I have very different opinions about what it means to be a generalized rulebook versus a specialized rulebook. And unfortunately for D&D 3.5, D&D is a very specialized system. This is not a system that exists in a vacuum. The first edition of Dungeons and Dragons was very clearly, not, to the point and very obviously based off of The Lord of the Rings. To the point where I forget if this is true or not, so take it with a grain of salt, but there's this idea that the original run of D&D First Edition still used the word hobbit to describe what would eventually become halflings. They were still using the terms being used by Tolkien in Lord of the Rings to describe his characters in their tabletop role-playing game that was supposed to be its own thing. But it was very clearly based on Middle-earth. It was very clearly based on Lord of the Rings. And a lot of people who have been in the gaming scene for a long time, who have seen the shifting landscape of political ideology in the ttrpg space, those people will probably want me to acknowledge, and I will acknowledge. I see you, and I'm giving you the signal right here. I'm going to acknowledge the fact that the Lord of the Rings was maybe a bit in need of a sensitivity reader, if you catch my drift. And D&D has kind of taken those ideas that are now extremely outdated and a little bit sus, and has rolled with them for many years. They've only now recently, in D&D 5th edition, started to try to strip away some of the racism and xenophobia that existed in the original D&D system. But there's a bunch of remnants of it left over, and I do want to acknowledge that to all the people in my audience who are savvy about that sort of thing, as I am. And I want to say, D&D is not a system that you get into if you are looking for instance, queer stories, or you're looking for stories that appeal to the experiences of people of color, these are not games that are built for those demographics. These are games that are built, pardon my French, for white boys who grew up in the 80s. And that's okay. We just have to acknowledge it. It's now been 45 minutes and I haven't actually talked about the game. That's a good start. I thought I was going to talk about the game in half an hour and then be done. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me for a moment. Let me just mute. Wow, that was unfortunate. Let's see, what was I talking about? We were talking about D&D. D&D 3.5. This system that is the successor to what many people consider the first quote-unquote real version of D&D, which was advanced D&D. It is chock full of bizarre decisions. I would say that D&D 3.5 is a very good example of like a what not to do system. Now, I do also want to clarify, going back to the conceptual terms. If you look at the scale of fudge, you can play a game that's anywhere on this scale. But D&D is definitely here. All right, D&D 3.5. 5e is better about it. D&D 3.5 is essentially a game that has so many rules that suck and you don't want to use that most people just don't. The thing about it is that, and you remember how I was talking about how this game inspired a bunch of video games, specifically Neverwinter Nights, for the kiddos out there. Neverwinter Nights is the game that became the Neverwinter free-to-play MMO, and Knights of the Old Republic, which, for, again, the kiddies out there, or alternatively, the old people who play those MMOs, sorry, Dad, are the games that became the Knights of the Old Republic MMO. And so, these are old games that are built around this system. And at the same time, not a single one of them is actually using the rules. Not a single video game that is based on, quote unquote, D&D 3.5e is actually playing by the rules of 3.5e. Nobody plays by the rules of D&D 3.5e. Because the rules of D&D 3.5e are really lame and kind of annoying. So let's go into it. We haven't cracked open this book yet. But let's just scroll on down. I'm going to be careful about how I scroll, trying to not scroll too fast, trying to kind of give you a quick look about it. Something I'm going to do for books that aren't D&D is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to flash, this sort of session, or this sort of section, right? I want you to understand where to buy these things. For itch.io games, I'm going to plug the itch.io page. I have no shame. I think people deserve more recognition. For this, though, I'll just tell you that Dungeons & Dragons is made by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. It's owned by Wizards of the Coast, and you can go purchase it at dungeonsanddragons.com or at any book retailer, literally anywhere. Like, I'm serious. You can go to a used bookstore. You can go to an Amazon warehouse and beat up the guy who protects all of the packages at the Amazon warehouse. You can go to any game store, like, at all, and they will have some D&D thing sitting there. I went to the game store, like, literally yesterday. D&D was sitting there right on the shelf. You can go buy it wherever it may be sold. Gotta give everybody credit. All right. D&D 3.5e. You may notice There's a lot here. There's like a lot here. Now, people who are super familiar with the D&D space will already know a lot of what I'm about to talk about. They're thinking, oh my god, she's going to talk about carrying capacity. And I am. That's true. That's the first thing we're going to talk about. I promise I will make it quick. We're going to go to page 162 here. It might shift a little bit because of the way... Oh, no, it's fine. Sometimes these PDFs have extra pages that counters the page count that aren't marked on the pages. So let me just... Whoa. Let me just read the section about carrying capacity. First of all, I do want to point out that this book is extremely hard to read. Look at this text. This text, I'm having trouble reading it when I'm like mousing over it. This is a garbled fucking rule book. And again, when was this released? You know, when did we get this release? When did we get this? D&D 3.5e. This was 2003. So this is one of those cases where, you know, classic Simpsons joke, as was the style at the time. Writing books where you couldn't fucking read any of the words, definitely the style of the time. A sip of my soda there. Let's talk about it, okay? So I'm just gonna start reading, and I'm gonna sort of like stop at the part where I think it's getting a little excessive. Okay. Encumbrance rules determine how much a character's armor and equipment slow them down. Oh, this is another thing. I'm not going to use him or her. Again, 2003 was the style at the time. You know, nowadays, you know, I am an agender person. I refuse to acknowledge the idea that there are only two genders that you have to use in every single book, and you have to clarify that both male trademark and female trademark are playing your ttrpg. We have moved past that. All right, so in any case where they use him or her in a rule book, I'm going to switch it to them, both for my own personal comfort and the comfort of basically everybody in the chat. But just a lot of games mess this up, especially older ones. Encumbrance rules determine how much a character's armor and equipment slow them down. Encumbrance comes in two parts: encumbrance by armor and encumbrance by total weight. A character's armor, as described on table 7.6, Armor and Shields, page 123, defines their maximum dexterity bonus to AC, armor check penalty, speed, and running speed. Unless your character is weak or carrying a lot of gear, that's all you need to know. The extra gear your character carries, such as weapons and rope, won't slow them down any more than the armor already does. If your character is weak or carrying a lot of gear, however, then you'll need to calculate encumbrance by weight. Doing so is most important when your character is trying to carry some heavy objects, such as a treasure chest. If you want to determine whether your character's gear is heavy enough to slow them down more than the armor already does, total the weight of all the character's items, including armor, weapons, and gear, and compare this total to the character's strength on table 9.1 carrying capacity. That's on the next page. Depending on how the weight compares to the character's carrying capacity, they may be carrying a light, medium, or heavy load. Like armor, a character's load affects their maximum dexterity bonus to AC. Carries a check penalty, which works like an armor check penalty, reduces the character's speed, and affects how fast the character can run, as shown on table 9.2 carrying loads. A medium or heavy load counts as medium or heavy armor for the purpose of abilities or skills that are restricted by armor. Carrying a light load does not encumber a character. If your character is wearing armor, use the worst figure from armor or from load for each category and do not stack the penalties. For example, here we go. Toradek is wearing scale mail. As shown on table 7.6 Armor and Shields, this armor cuts his maximum dex bonus to AC to +3 and gives him a -4 armor check penalty, and would cut his speed to 15 feet were not a dwarf and thus able to move normally even when encumbered by an armor or load. The total weight of his gear, including armor, is 71.5 pounds. Since Tordik has a strength of 15, his maximum carrying capacity or maximum load is 200 pounds. A medium load for him is 67 pounds or more, and a heavy load is 130 pounds or more, so he's carrying a medium load. Looking at the medium load line on table 9.2 carrying loads, his player sees that these figures are all equal to or less than the penalties that Tordik is already incurring for wearing scale mail, so he takes no extra penalties. Jesus Christ. This is Crunch Central. This is like, holy shit. First of all, crunch up the ass. Second of all, this is dry crunch. This isn't, oh, it's, you know, you're looking at carrying capacity because it's extremely important to the game. You're looking at carrying capacity because the game tells you you have to. That's dry. That's dry and crunchy, and good God, does that make the game feel like a slog. Imagine having to read this section. Imagine playing D&D and your character is walking down a hallway and you pick up a goblet and your dungeon master says, "Hold right there, buckaroo. You're over your carrying capacity. Let me see your character sheet." And then they give you a fucking formula and they say, "Could you turn to page 162, chapter 9 of the Player's Handbook Premium Edition? And could you go ahead and read the section to me? Show me the table. Could you show me table 9.2 carrying loads?" And then you go, "Oh, okay." And then he says, "I see the problem here. You know, you're only going to be getting a maximum dex bonus of +1, you know, and that means your speed's going to be lowered to 20 feet instead of 30 feet, which means you're going to have a different movement speed in combat, which means that you're going to have a different movement speed down this hallway, which means you don't outrun the boulder trap, rocks fall, everybody dies." That's the kind of game that D&D 3.5 is trying to sell you on. Trying to sell you on this idea that everything needs to be calculated. Everything needs to be crunched out. You can't pick up a book without checking your character sheet, side-eyeing your character sheet to just really make sure that you know, you're not picking up a 3-pound book that puts you over 233 pounds, which would give you a medium load at a strength score of 24, which means that you now have a maximum dex penalty, which means that your combination strength and dex character is now fucked forever. That's the kind of thing D&D 3.5 really struggles with. You may have this preconception that this rule doesn't exist, because if you're like me, you have never seen this rule before, ever, until you're reading the 3.5 rulebook straight and not like listening to a dungeon master tell you how to play the game. And that is because this rule about carrying capacity, one of the most unpopular rules in the game. I have never played a game of D&D where carrying capacity mattered. I really haven't. It's never been relevant. But it gets worse. Okay? It gets worse. Because we're going to get into movement rules. Now, do keep in mind that all of this is already built on top of the ideas of carrying capacity. So we have all of carrying capacity, and keep in mind, carrying capacity is much more complicated than I've made it out to be. You're already doing all of these complicated things here, but you have to make sure that you can tell whether you can lift other characters in your party, as the book says. As an example, Mealy is knocked unconscious in a fight, and Tordek wants to carry her out of the dungeon. She weighs 104 pounds, with an additional 38 pounds from gear and items. So Tordek can't carry her and her gear, because doing so would put him over his 200-pound maximum load. And so you have to split the difference. But you now have a penalty to movement. Now, in a modern ttrpg, at the most, you would have a small paragraph saying, characters who lift other characters move half as fast. That's all the rule would be in a modern TTRPG. And I'm putting my foot down about this. This is only the kind of obscene crunch that you get from TTRPGs from this era. This isn't something you see in 5th edition. Or if there is something like this in 5th edition, I can guarantee nobody plays with that rule in effect. This is what I was talking about with the idea of fucky scaling on the fudge scale. Nobody wants to play this, but they're dedicating 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. No, 5 full pages of their rulebook to telling you exactly how this optional rule that, well, it's not even optional, is it? People just treat it like it is. That's what fucky means. When a rule isn't optional, but everybody treats it like it's an optional rule, you're probably playing a pretty fucky game. Now, I could do this all day. Okay, I could point out the fact that you have the option to walk or hustle. All right. That's different from running, but of course, running times 3 is different from running times 4. All right. I could point out the fact that this is a miniatures game, right? This is a game where you're supposed to be keeping track of every single step that your characters take. I could point out that if you were in difficult terrain with an obstacle and poor visibility, you would have to move 6 times slower, even though that conceptually doesn't even necessarily make any sense. And I could point out that there are entire rules for traveling across the overworld, right? When you're outside of a dungeon, traveling across the country, that have both way too specific requirements where you can only walk 8 hours in a day of travel, but also really vague requirements. Because if you actually look, a character can walk for more than 8 hours in a day by making a forced march. And for each hour marching beyond 8 hours, something happens, right? But that actually means that the rule isn't 8 hours. It means that if you walked for 8 hours and 59 minutes, there would technically be no penalty. But if you walked for exactly 9 hours, you would have to make a constitution check. And you'd have to keep track of how many of those constitution checks you've already made, because it's DC 10. That's DC is the difficulty. I believe it stands for difficulty check or something. So difficulty check 10 plus 2 per extra hour, which then gives you 1d6 points of non-lethal damage. So then you have to figure out what non-lethal damage means, and then you have to figure out what fatigue means. And then it says at the end of this entire section, covering all of this math about how you move across the world, it's possible for a character to march into unconsciousness by pushing himself too hard. Doesn't give a number, doesn't give an idea. At that point, finally, after all of these rules about you're not allowed to walk for more than 8 hours a day, but it's actually 8 hours and 59 minutes a day, but actually you can walk for longer than that, so long as you're willing to take a chance on taking some damage, but the damage can't actually knock you out unless the DM says it knocks you out, in which case it does knock you out. Good grief. This is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that D&D is a bloated system. And I'm going to use that word a lot to describe a lot of different games. But when I'm talking about bloating, I'm talking about mechanics that don't really add anything to the experience. But you have to understand, this is a holdover from the conceptualization of D&D. D&D was conceptualized as Lord of the Rings. Remember, it was conceptualized as, you know, a sort of tabletop spin-off thing with the names scrubbed off for Lord of the Rings. And what's the most important thing in Lord of the Rings? What's the thing that they do in The Hobbit? They walk, they trek, they camp out in the wilderness. And you can tell that the people who were writing this game really wanted to evoke that feeling where travel was arduous, where you would trek up a mountain and you would have to choose between walking, hustling, running, forced marching, going on a horse, you know, taking the eagle versus riding on a pony, you know, all of this stuff. And then, of course, if you actually look, God help you, if you look at the rules about the mounts have their own carrying capacity, oftentimes, keeping in mind, oftentimes much lower than a character's actual maximum carrying capacity. You have to understand, if you are on a war pony, they can carry less than a character with 20 strength. So if you sit on that war pony and you're a character who has that much strength and you're carrying a heavy load, that war pony can't move at all. It's stuck under your heavy butt. And so it's just layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of these rules that don't really benefit anybody. Because every time I've played a game of 3.5e, and if you've played one of the video game adaptations of the system, you know nothing like this ever comes up. There are no death marches across the wilderness. There is no calculating whether the riding dog is a better mount for your warrior than the light horse. You know? You just ask your DM for a cool dog. And the DM assumes that when you ask for a dog that you can ride on, you're not asking for a dog that your character is too heavy to sit on. You're asking for a proper dog that you want to use. And you don't want to spend a bunch of gold on something you can't use. There's all of the stuff that builds up and up and up and up into making D&D into this mess of a system that really pushes the boundaries of what's acceptable with mechanical bloat. And the worst part is, so many of these bloated mechanics that nobody uses, that everybody cuts out of their games, so many of these mechanics are holdovers from interesting ideas. And this is why, again, I can't stress this enough. I want to say that this isn't a review show because there are people who adore shit like this. If you're watching the stream right now and you're saying, oh my God, a mechanic that I can use so that players can only travel a certain amount of distance in a single day, I'm making an entire campaign about the Oregon Trail, and this mechanic would be perfect for it. We'll have to figure out all of this stuff, but that's the problem with D&D 3.5. Not everybody is playing Oregon Trail, the D&D campaign. Some people just want the time between a character going from a mountain to a town to be as easy and light as snapping your fingers, right? Oh, yep, you're good. You walk back to town. You walk to your campsite. Skip the distance. Don't calculate it. That makes the game faster. Something that people have always complained about D&D is that it is slow, especially in combat. And this is the sort of thing that makes combat type scenarios, these encounters, these situations, slower, and you have to do more work with your brain. This is what I was talking about with thickness. This is a game that you're going to be sitting and playing for 5 hours because Jim hasn't figured out whether his character is technically in a forced march or not. because he didn't realize that a donkey and a mule did not have the same carrying capacity. And so he's checking his character sheet. He's been checking his character sheet for the past 5 minutes. And you've been sitting there drinking your Pepsi going, oh my God, I've made the decision to show up today. And it's at that point that a ttrpg has failed you. When you are sitting at the table and you are going, oh, I would rather be anywhere else, the system has failed. Because the entire point of the system is to keep you here. It's to keep you engaged. And in 2003, these ideas were interesting. But we have so many more efficient things. In the current day and age of ttrpgs, I would actually really like to see an Oregon Trail tabletop role-playing game that uses mechanics such as these. Mechanics about very specific carrying weights and very specific animals and conditions and road options and, inclement weather. All of these different interesting ideas. But these ideas are not in service to this game. They're in service to a game that doesn't exist. And I really want to hit that point. That games like this are putting hot ideas on the burner that don't serve the idea. You don't put soy sauce on your oatmeal. You don't put Worcestershire sauce on your pina colada. Some things are designed for certain flavor profiles, and that's kind of something I want to keep coming back to. Flavor. TTRPGs are all about flavor. It's all about the vibe that the game gives you. Rules like these aren't flavorful. You're putting soy sauce in your ice cream, right? And you're going, it's like, oh God, what have I done? I put hundreds of weird mechanics into this game. I've discovered, I've given my short sword 2 HP. I have no idea what that even means. But, if I get hit by something, then it might break my short sword, right? You have all these concepts. This is something that D&D 3.5 did very well. You have interesting concepts, right? Hey, look, you have HP for items. That means items might be able to break. There's a classic D&D thing about rust monsters ruining players who would just go in there and try to hit it, and then the sword would break, and then they'd try to block it, and their shield would break, and then it'd bite them in the chest, and their chest armor would break, and then they'd be screwed. They'd be in a cave with no armor and no weapons. Nothing. Those were interesting experiences. But giving every single short sword in the game 2 HP, where you have to focus on it, it pulls you out of the experience when you're supposed to be immersed. These are the things that really drag down a game. And so I'm going to go back to page 3, which I believe was the page with... Might take a moment to load, so we'll have to give it a bit. There we go. So I'm going to go back here. And now we have been streaming for about 1 hour and 15 minutes. That's not too bad. But I do want to look at a bit more than just carrying capacity. Because again, look at this index. What is this index? This is a list of numbered tables. Oh, good grief. List of numbered tables. And this is actually in the section of the game in adventuring. Right? Isn't adventuring supposed to make you excited? Now, I could talk about D&D 3.5 all day. Right? I could talk about how the idea of naming your character, your character subspecies, quote unquote, races to really hit home the Tolkienized, sort of weird, vague, like Orientalist, colonialist concepts there. You know, very, very, very coming across the ocean type colonialism there. Very, very come on down to the Americas. We have whatever the word native means, you know. Very, very like bad vibes from this. We can talk about how like getting down to it was like, oh, orcs, orcs, they have a lower intelligence than the other races. Like, terrible. Oh, gross. I didn't want to say that. I hate saying shit like that. Game makes you say shit like that all the time. Ugh, gross. You talk about alignment and how it interacts with religion, which is its own entire can of worms. We can talk about micro rules. In fact, I think I'm going to talk about micro rules, because if I can find it, there are rules about like individual, here we go, spells on page 181. This is another one of those famous D&D rules. One of those famous D&D rules that people never... In M or F, appearing at the end of a spell's name in the spell list denotes a spell with a material or focus component that is not normally included in a spell component pouch. This is one of the many rules that D&D came up with and then nobody wanted to use because, good grief, it's boring and frustrating. Let me scroll down here. Oh, look at how much easier this is to read. There is so much here, right? We have... I wish they would talk more about material or focus components. To initiate the uninitiated. In D&D, I think this may still be a thing, unfortunately. Any spellcaster must use material components. This is the classic bit. This is a classic bit from... Oh gosh, what's the name of the video? There's a classic D&D joke video where somebody's talking about Morton Keiton's faithful watchdog, and the joke, it's the dungeon master and the player arguing. Player says, "You didn't ask me to prepare my spell beforehand, but I need material components for all my spells, so I'd like to cast Morton Keiton's faithful watchdog." And it's an entire, it's a hilarious video. If you're into D&D, it probably makes no sense if you haven't played this system before. But that's what it is I want to do this thing. And I have the thing that I need to do this thing. And the DM responds, "No, you don't. You never specified." This is what kills the D&D playing experience. The line, "you never specified," is something that just makes you want to get up out of your chair and punch the person who told it to you. Like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not specifying because I'm using common sense. But D&D is a system that requires you to specify fucking everything. You have to say what your spell components are. What is in your spell component pouch, if you even know, if the game even tells you what that might mean. Whether that component is something you need for a specific spell, or if it's something that you don't. Do you need a glass orb, for instance, to cast Morton Keiton's faithful watchdog? Probably not. but you might, and you gotta specify that. And I do have to just say out loud, you can't keep track of this on a character sheet. This is way too much information for a single character sheet. And so this is the game that defined having your character sheet and your character sheet and your sheet character sheet and a notepad on your desk while you're trying to play this game. Because you have to write every little teensy weensy thing down. It's just such a slog. This is an example, I think, of a game being unnecessarily thick, right? This is the classic, right? What is D&D? It's completely thick, it's completely crunch, and it's completely dry. Because they're not giving a reason. They're not introducing the idea of a spell component and why that's important to the story. They're not talking about intricacies of how magic is cast in this universe and why people need spell components, why people need materials and foci and spell component pouches and where that stuff goes. They're not mentioning any of it. It's all numbers. It's if it has an M or an F, you have to pay X amount of gold in town before you are planning on casting the spell so that you can cast it later. That is what it is. And what that boils down to is micromanagement. And not just micromanagement at the cost of your own character's efficiency. If you actually played, again, can't stress this enough, no game, Neverwinter Nights doesn't use this rule, right? In Neverwinter Nights, if you want to cast a spell, you hold down the right mouse button and then you select that damn spell and then it does it for you. Because if you had to have a spell component pouch and keep track of which exact herbs you needed to cast this, right? Oh, you know, I don't have the right crystals to cast Mage Hand. You know, so I can't use it. That would kill game pacing and that would make everybody playing the game miserable. And so what people have decided over time is that D&D 3.5 is a great system if you pretend you're playing a video game and you cut out everything that doesn't act in service of that. And that trimmed down version of D&D 3.5 that everybody remembers playing is a very reasonable system for playing as a general fantasy campaign, right? That's not bad. What I have qualms with is D&D 3.5's own basic rulebook, introducing all of this garbage that doesn't do anything. Who cares? This is the question that people always ask. When you're reading this book, right, you get to the carrying capacity, and the first thing you say as a DM, as a dungeon master, is you go, who cares? I'm not going to make my players walk for 8 hours and announce every hour passing so that they can determine when their carrying capacity puts them into death march. No, that's ridiculous. Yeah, I'm not going to do that work because I'm tired and I've spent the entire day making the campaign. I don't have time to keep track of it. And I know that my players don't want to keep track of it. So screw it. Who cares? And that's what D&D thrives on. D&D thrives. D&D 3.5 thrives on that who cares mentality. That why is this rule here? And you know what? I'm just going to ignore it. I have played D&D 3.5 without miniatures, and I have to stress that I don't believe miniatures are optional in D&D 3.5. And when you just remove miniatures from a miniatures game because they're getting in the way, that is something that D&D is kind of implying that you need to really... How do I phrase this? It's kind of implying that D&D needs to get its act together, is what I'm saying. If you have to remove the miniatures from your miniatures game, it should not have been a miniatures game at all. This is not Warhammer. All right? This is not Warhammer. We don't need all of these miniatures rules that, again, a lot of people just never used. We're getting page after page after page after page of things, of just things characters could do. You know, maybe summon monster 1. What is summon monster 1? Well, summon monster 1 has a list of monsters it can summon. What are the list of monsters? Go find it. It's in a table somewhere. You know, marching order. Oh my god, I was looking for this. Marching order. This is the most unnecessary rule in the entire game, and I'll tell you why it's called a knowledge check. Let me tell you the song. This is a song that a lot of D&D players know. Don't you know you never split the party? Clerics in the back keep the fighter head and hardy. The wizard in the middle so he can cast some light. And you never let the damn thief out of sight. That's the song. And as soon as that song apparated into existence, this rule became useless because you always follow that formation. This rule is supposed to be about playing a miniatures game. It's about positioning. Right? It's about who is where on the map and how are they interacting with the area around them. So what order you're walking in is supposed to be important, but once you understand that it goes fighter, wizard, cleric, thief in that order, it becomes a joke. It becomes a rule that you don't even have to say out loud. And again, it turns into this game of you didn't specify. You didn't specify that the cleric wasn't in the back of the party, so I've decided as the DM that he's in the front and he's getting hit by a giant brick to the face. And that means you're dead. Because you didn't specify. D&D 3.5. I'm kind of getting into my closing arguments here. D&D 3.5 is a system that taught many players that this is what TTRPGs are. The TTRPGs are pencil pushing games. That TTRPGs are games about math and memorizing books. Because that's what it is. When people were talking about D&D, the first thing that always comes up is arguing with your dungeon master. Because for years, people assumed that if the dungeon master won, that meant that the players were dead. But it's not. We know better now. We know that games are collaborative. We know that the real purpose of Dungeons and Dragons is for the DM to tell a story that you all of the players, get to help write. Right? Now we obviously understand that all the dice rolling and all the numbers are supposed to be stand-ins for immersion. Sorry, I said immersion weird. Immersion, like literally this idea of the modern immersive Civ gaming experience. Sim, not Civ. Well, we have been going for an hour and a half, so it's no surprise that my tongue's starting to slip up a little. For many years, people were convinced that D&D was a competitive game. It was every player versus every other player. You know, you're trying to get more loot than Gary. And Chris is trying to keep both of you from doing anything because he's the DM, and that means he's a control freak asshole, and that means your job is to know the rules better than he does. Because if you know the rules better, then you can be the one to say, actually, you didn't specify. And in the rules, you have to specify. This is the sort of stuff that people were talking about in the early 2000s, and especially stuff like the late 90s when people were playing advanced D&D. When people were talking about having these awful campaign experiences where everyone was on edge and trying to one-up each other. Everyone was trying to be the person who knew the rules best so that they could get all the cool stuff and beat all the other players in a game that's supposed to be collaborative storytelling about a world. You know, The Hobbit would not have been better if Gandalf pushed Frodo off the damn mountain. It just wouldn't have. But that's what D&D 3.5 provides for players in its basic state. And again, Pathfinder exists now. The D&D 3.5 video games exist and have existed for a very long time. People know how to play D&D 3.5 in a way where you skip all of this crap. But that's with the rules. It's putting this, in essence, into the game that doesn't exist on its own. It's changing the game into what you want it to be instead of finding a game that you want to play. I talked earlier about the idea of uh, an Oregon Trail tabletop game. What I want to teach you with this show is that you never have to settle for this. You never have to settle for a generic system where you have to crop out half of the rules and then so that you can play the game in the way you want to play it. D&D is not your only option. D&D has never been your only option. And I'm going to teach you how to find what you want to play. So don't play this. Don't play D&D 3.5. Just don't. If you want to play the thing that you remember D&D 3.5 playing like, or you like the idea of D&D 3.5, there are other options for you that will perform that role in the TTRPG space better. The thing I'll leave you with is that when D&D 3.5 was introduced, the common misconception was that every role-playing game had to cover every type of player. That every TTRPG had to be for the mechanics guy, and the storytelling guy, and the role-playing guy, and the dice rolling guy. All of these people had to play the same system, or at least that's what people believed. And people believed that if you made your system super specialized, that you wouldn't get any players. I am going to prove that wrong. I have 390 TTRPGs that I haven't looked at before. And I am going to show you as many of them as I can. I'm going to tell you why they're interesting. I'm going to tell you what they specialize in, what the mechanics are like, how those mechanics feel to play. And without even sitting down at the table with a bag of dice, I am going to share with you which games you might want to consider purchasing. That's the show. So, I'm gonna leave this out with a quippy one-liner, and then I'm gonna go look at my big collection of TTRPGs, and I'm gonna think about what we're going to talk about next. I will see you all then. Meantime, have fun playing. Don't get caught up in D&D 3.5 or anything. That was a terrible one-liner. that was the weakest. That wasn't even a one-liner, was it? No. Anyway, I'll see all of you next time on What's on the Table. Bye-bye now.